All right, hi guys. Today we're going to be doing some nature of science review. So I'm just going to go over all the things that we've been talking about this year, hit on some review. We are going to have our test on this unit next Wednesday. I'm going to upload a study guide to Google Classroom, which will be an extra credit opportunity. If you complete that study guide and turn that in, make sure you hit the turn in button. Then you'll get 5 points of extra credit added onto your grade, and that'll be on there in time for interims. But everything that I'm going through in this PowerPoint here is everything that's going to be on your test on Wednesday. All right, so first up are variables. We have independent variables, dependent variables, and constant variables. So our independent variables, that's what I control or what I change. So whatever the scientist is controlling in the experiment, the one thing that they're changing, that's the independent variable. So remember, the independent is what I control or what I change. The dependent variable, that's what's being measured or the data that we're collecting. So the dependent variable is data that we're collecting. And our constant variables, that's what's going to stay the same between all of our different trials. So that's there you'll have multiple constants because remember, we only change one thing at a time. That's our independent. Everything else we want to keep constant. So we know we're only looking at the effect of that independent variable. So here's an example. So our scenario is I think that plants will grow fastest under red light. To test this, I grow plants under red, blue, green, and normal lights. I give them all the same amount of light and water, and I measure their plant height every day for 3 weeks. So that's our scenario. So our independent variable, what I control or what I change, is going to be the different color of light. So that different color of light is my independent variable. My dependent variable, the data I'm collecting, is going to be the plant height. Our dependent variable, whatever data we're collecting, that's the data that we're using to answer our question. So look, my original question is, under what color light will plants grow fastest? In order to answer that question, I have to measure plant height. So our dependent variable is what we're going to use to answer our question. Constants, I should keep everything else about these plants that's not the color of light they're grown under the exact same. I should use the same kind of plant, the same amount of light, the same amount of water, the same temperature, same soil. Everything about these plants should be identical except for my independent variable, which is that different color of light. All right, next up we have something called a control group versus experimental group. So our experimental group, that's going to be the group that receives whatever that special treatment is, receives the independent variable. Our control group is going to be how things would happen naturally, so we have something to compare to. So if we go back to the last slide, we're growing plants under red, blue, green, and normal lights. Our red, blue, and green lights, that would be our test group, our experimental group. The normal light, that would be our control group because they're just getting that normal light. The reason why we have a control group is so we have something to compare to. So here's an example of how you might see that asked. So in an experiment, 100 rose plants were grown under red wavelengths of light. An additional 100 rose plants were grown under normal light conditions. The rose plants grown under normal light conditions were the blank. So our rose plants that were grown under normal light conditions, that is going to be our control group because they just get whatever the normal, however it would regularly naturally be, that's what they're getting. Our test group or experimental group, that would be our rose plants grown under the red wavelengths of light. And the reason why is because, so if we only grew these plants under red wavelengths of light, we wouldn't have anything to compare that data to. Now that we have some grown under red and some grown under normal, we can compare them to each other and we can see if that if the red wavelength has an effect on that plant height. All right, next up is our type of scientific studies. We have 3 different types: controlled experiments, observational studies, and research studies. Our first type, controlled experiments, that's when we're going to have our variables. That's when the scientist is going to be controlling the situation, they're manipulating the independent variable, they're measuring their dependent variable, and they're keeping other things controlled. So that's a controlled experiment. An observational study, that's when the scientist is only watching. They're not controlling anything, they're not interfering, they're just watching things happen naturally, and they're making observations on it. And lastly, we have our research study, which research study is when the scientist is not collecting their own data, but they're using previously published data, so data that's already out there. So when you read how this will be on a test is you'll see an example of a study. I'd give you a scenario, and then you'd tell me which of these it is. So first thing you ask yourself when you read through a scenario is my scientist collecting their own data? If they are not collecting their own data, it's a research study. If they are collecting their own data, then you're going to ask yourself, is the scientist controlling anything? If they're controlling that independent variable, it's going to be a controlled experiment. If the scientist is not controlling anything, then that's going to be your observational study. All right, so here's an example of that. A scientist wants to know how individual lions within a pride interact with each other in their own environment. To do this, the scientist sedates and tags all of the lions within a pride. Then he places several remotely controlled video cameras near the lion's den and performs an observational field study. He collects continuous video footage over the span of 1 year, analyzes the video, and then forms conclusions based on his observations. So first thing we ask ourselves, is my scientist collecting data? The answer here is yes. He's making observations on this lion behavior. So we know it's not a research study. And then we ask ourselves, is the scientist controlling anything here? Do we have an independent variable? In this experiment, in this scenario, we do not. The scientist is just watching that behavior as it happens naturally. There's no independent variable. The scientist isn't controlling anything. So that means we have an observational study. So this would be an example of an observational study. All right, theories and laws. So theories are going to explain why something happens, and laws are going to say what will happen. So for example, let's say I drop this remote. A law will tell me that that remote is going to drop to the ground. It's not going to tell me why. It's not going to tell me how. It's just going to tell me what's going to happen. The remote's going to fall. Theories are going to explain why something happens. So a theory would tell me why this remote's going to fall when I drop it. So theories explain and laws describe what will happen. So our laws give us our what, and our theories give us our why. Next up is our observation and inference. So an observation, that's just information we gather with our 5 senses. That's just what's there. You can't argue with it. It's what's there. Inferences, those are going to be conclusions that we come to based on our observations. So that's where we say, based on what I'm observing, this is what I think is happening. So I use this picture as an example. So some observations I could make for this picture are, there are destroyed houses. The trees do not have any leaves on them. There are no people around. Those are some observations that I could make about this picture. Notice I'm just describing what's there. An inference, that's when I'm going to take my observations and use those to come to a conclusion about what's going on. So an inference that I could make about this picture was maybe a tornado went through, or maybe a hurricane went through. So you see, observation, I was just describing what's there. And inference, that's when I'm coming to a conclusion. All right, next up is our different types of observations. So with our different types of observations, we have qualitative observations and we have quantitative observations. So qualitative observation, that's when we describe something with words. Like if we say the lab tables are black and smooth, or it smells like popcorn, using words to describe something. Quantitative is something that we can measure or count. So saying it is 68 degrees in this classroom, or there are 24 students in this classroom. That's quantitative. So the easiest way to remember this is going to be that L in qualitative, that's for letters. We're using words to describe things. And that N in quantitative, that's for numbers. That's when we're going to measure or count something. So qualitative is when we use letters or words to describe, and quantitative is when we use numbers to measure or count. So a quantitative observation that I could make about this picture on the bottom here is there are 8 of the little Among Us guys. I don't know what they're called, but I know they're the Among Us guys. There's 8 of them. A qualitative observation I could make is I could describe colors. I could say there are 2 green, there are 2 blue. Those would be qualitative observations. So that is all of the topics that are going to be covered on your test. For the rest of the class period today, you're going to be doing some different review type activities. I have several options for you. I have a Kahoot. I have 2 different types of Book It. So you're going to be using the rest of this period to review. Again, I'm going to be posting that extra credit study guide to you. You could also use your review time to work on that extra credit study guide. In order to get those 5 points extra credit, you have to hit that turn in button because that's how it shows up to me that you've done that study guide. So now that this video is over, you can either do review games or you can work on your study guide and you will have the rest of class to do that. Remember, your goal is to earn 5 stars. You can do that by following procedures, participating in your work, and being respectful to the sub in the room. Bye, guys. If you have any questions, email me. My email is on the Google Classroom in lots of different places. Otherwise, it's just wicker.alexandria@brevardschools.org. So please let me know if you need help. Otherwise, you have the rest of the day to be working on this. Bye, guys.